I think so.
operas.
That's definitely part of it.
So, isn't this fascinating? Things were not as different as we would expect.
Yeah. Although it is interesting that the question of standards of orchestral playing,
Yes.
there can be no doubt that we are living in just a remarkable
Yes,
age in that
people
regard.
would have just fallen over dead with shock if they heard the way we played
Yeah.
now. But maybe, though, there was more of a sense of surprise then.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
We read lots of descriptions of how responsive the audience
Yes.
was to music, that they would even gasp or even applaud in the middle of a movement when something happened unexpected.
Yes.
When Berlioz talks about this, the music makes in Mozart or in his own Requiem makes a surprising modulation, and people would go ah. And of course, we would be horrified. We wouldn't dare do that now.
Liszt doesn't need to talk about because he would take for granted that this would occur.
Mm-hmm.
I remember also something I just recently read. Beethoven's Fifth is being performed in Germany. The equivalent of the Paris Conservatoire concerts. It's now a piece that gets performed a bunch, and people are used to going and hearing it. But even so, in the last movement, the passage with the rapidly descending scales in the violin, this account talks about the violinists and the audience making eye contact, all knowing that they were hearing something extraordinary that they weren't used to. But now comes the interesting question. That was a wonderfully lively part of the music world, which doesn't exist anymore. To what extent, now, I'm saying something a little speculative, to what extent does Liszt's emphasis on being very, very serious here work in the long run against that kind of spontaneity, while, of course, encouraging other worthwhile values?
I think there is a problem, and you've written about this, and a lot of us have been very kind of intrigued to discuss how we can shake up a little bit the all too settled world of concert music in America, where concerts have become, and maybe in Europe too, where concerts have become so routinized and audience behavior is so appropriate and restrained and so on, that there isn't a sense of involvement. I wonder whether maybe some of this back then, people in a certain city had much more of a connection with members of an orchestra. They would know that the flutist or the first hornist and so on, and have an idea of that particular sound that person could make. There was certainly a much more distinctive local tradition of music making back then. That continued into Europe in the 20th century.
I think
too.
orchestras now are to some extent trying to bring this back by putting the musicians more in front of the public. The simple way to do it is devote a couple of pages of the program book to a profile of individual musicians, but they can come out on stage and speak. I have seen situations sometimes where people in the audience will go up to the stage before the concert starts and talk to musicians they know, which is lovely. But this, I think, what you have translated for us all here, and what we're talking about is a turning point in the way music is understood, taught, fostered, and performed. A turning point towards seriousness, which has the virtue of leading to better performances and more frequent performances of more serious repertoire, but at the loss of a certain amount of spontaneity. Which is probably something we're still wrestling with. One thing I've read is that at those Paris Conservatoire concerts, which again should say this is not dead history. This is one of the places where Beethoven's symphonies began to come into the repertoire to hold the place that they hold now. Didn't happen automatically just once they were first performed. So it became routine at the transition from the third movement of the Fifth Symphony into the finale. When the finale burst forth like a sunburst, people would applaud. Do you think Liszt liked that? Or was that something that Liszt would have thought people should be educated to suppress?
It's interesting. Liszt had both of those tendencies in himself. He was obviously a showman. And in his early years when he did play Beethoven sonatas, for example. He would sometimes exaggerate effects and be very flamboyant in his performance. And then he began to become more restrained as he maybe felt that people were beginning to take this seriously and he didn't have to try to sell it or oversell it. But in the process, he was beginning this process of classicization that you're saying. That making...
or Joseph Horowitz likes to use the word sacralization, which I think is a good term, making it almost a sacred right.
Yeah, it is interesting to see nowadays when occasionally a conductor does something a little extreme, or a soloist. We have people, a conductor like Sinopoli, for example, or a pianist like Lang Lang. There are people who say, whoa, that's too fast, too slow, you can't do that, right? And other people say, whoa, that was different, that was fun, that was interesting. And some people who would not be interested at all say, oh, classical music, I kind of like that. If that's classical music, I like it.
Well, something that comes to my mind is an extraordinary statement by Brahms that I came across in one of Robert Phillips' books about the early days of recording and how the advent of recording affected classical performance. I can't remember the context in which he brings it up, but Joachim, we mean Joseph Joachim, the great violinist and Brahms's friend, was going to conduct a performance of the Fourth Symphony when it was still very new. So he writes to Brahms and he says, tell me the tempi for each movement. And Brahms writes back with the metronome markings and says, but these are not the tempi I would want you to take when you know the piece better. But while you, the orchestra, and the audience don't know it, Brahms felt that all the contrasts in the piece should be exaggerated so that people who didn't know it could follow it better.
Oh, how interesting. That's a wonderful quote. I should see that. That is interesting, which is actually just what Liszt had done with the Beethoven sonatas early on.
And then pulled back from. Although I've read an account of Liszt playing in this second phase of his, the Moonlight Sonata, and although he added no embellishments as he had earlier and played it extremely seriously, he also had all the lights turned out. So now there was a theatrical staging of it, even though the music itself was done in the most serious fashion. So the showman was not extinct.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure. I think that Liszt at his most sober must have been a gripping performer. There's no question. I would have loved to be able to hear one of those concerts.
You know, that is so true. And it's built into his piano music. It's very easy to say from a very high church point of view, oh my God, the B minor sonata, it's so repetitious. He will simply repeat phrases in a slightly different key. And then you realize the point of it is to have it played so you're always on the edge of the seat. And that's why it's written the way it is.
Right.
So it's like Elvis singing, but it's Liszt playing.
That's great.
So this is an interesting demonstration, Ralph, of how, at least to me, musicology is not the dry as dust study that people sometimes think it is,
for sure,
and how it unearths red meat, things that are really distinctly relevant to our situation now.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that early on in the essay, he says the single biggest problem for people in the arts is that they are isolated, and including isolated from each other, so that musicians don't band together to try to solve their common problems, and musicians don't know what poets do and don't know what visual artists do, and so on. And that's certainly an ongoing problem. Obviously, some of that has been solved through unions and so on.
You know, I was just thinking of unions, considering that we have presumably an audience largely of orchestra musicians for what we're talking about here. These are people who have banded together to solve their problems. There's no doubt about that.
But often performing musicians, and I know from